Okay, it's 12 o'clock and I'm about to start. Esteemed ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues, this year is not only momentous because we celebrated 70 years of the great victory over Nazism, but because of a number of other jubilees related to the Second World War. And I mean, first and foremost, 70 years of the International Military Tribunal set up for the court in Nuremberg, and a trial of the Nazi Germany leaders, and also the 70 years since the foundation of the UN organization. Those are, of course, very important events which laid the foundation for the after-the-war world. It is especially sad that there are active attempts to rewrite history of the Second World War, which have been going on, to revise its results, to whitewash the Nazis, or to turn them into heroes, in fact, as well as their petty servants, the servants of the devil. Attempts are made to revise the final documents of the Nuremberg trial, which clearly defines the initiators and the culprits of this war, qualifies the Nazi ideology, the Nazi crimes, and the purpose of that unscrupulous attempts is to use historical speculation in geopolitical games and to provoke political phobias for the countries and peoples to fall apart. I would like to remind you that during the Second World War, Russia suffered huge losses, both in population and in material. Much more than any other country, or all the countries of the anti-Hitlerite coalition together. The human losses of the Soviet Union were 27 million. Of that, 16 million were civilians. With that, France lost 412,000, the UK about 92,000, the United States 3,000 people. Most of the Soviet people died in the occupied territory, in concentration camps, and at forced work. Nazis enslaved nearly 5 million of my compatriots. We should add to the human loss the fact that after the war, the birth rate in our country reduced by nearly 16%. So the total direct and indirect losses of the Soviet Union throughout the war and after the war was approximately 50 million people. In the territory of the USSR, Nazis fully or completely or partially destroyed and burned 1,700 towns and cities, over 70,000 villages, 6 million buildings. 25 million of our citizens became homeless. 1,670 Orthodox churches, 237 Roman Catholic churches were destroyed, as well as 532 synagogues. A lot of cultural values have been destroyed or stolen. The total amount of losses suffered by the Soviet Union is expressed in astronomical numbers, but it's very difficult to assess all that. And after that, some people advise that we forget all that. But I'm always saying, where do we find an axe to cut off our memories? I've been interested in the Nuremberg trial ever since the 60s. I wrote several books. I wrote script for several films, including 2 documentaries. I was luckier than anyone else because I had a chance to talk to all the participants in the Nuremberg trial on the Soviet time, with some foreign participants. Roman Rudenko passed on his archives to me. Mark Roginsky, his assistant, did the same. His son gave me a lot of documents. our main head of the interpreters, Alexander Goffman, who was the head of the interpretation service and who was at the same time, as we now know, was a professional intelligence officer, left a lot of interesting documents of great historical value. So today, jointly with you, I would come back to the well-known scenes and pages of that trial to tell you some facts that are not widely known and to talk about the present and the future in the context of the overall process of mankind development. I would like to emphasize that ever since the beginning of the war, the Soviet leaders insisted on an international trial over the leaders of the Nazi Germany. One cannot note that the impunity of the culprits of the First World War resulted in the leaders of the Nazi Germany to start a new war and to commit a lot of war crime. Article 227 and 228 of the Treaty of Versailles of 1918, however, that legally ended the First World War, contained an obligation to criminally prosecute the Kaiser of Germany, Wilhelm II, and his accomplices. The trial over the Kaiser was to be effected by a special tribunal consisting of 5 judges appointed by the UK, France, Italy, the United States, and Japan. That did not happen. Back in the end of the 1941, the Soviet government directly raised an issue before the Allies about the responsibility of the German government and command for the crimes committed in the occupied territories. On the 27th of April 1942, the government of the Soviet Union officially directed a note to all the envoys and ambassadors. Its title was "On Horrid Atrocities and Violence Committed by the German Nazi occupants in the occupied Soviet regions and about the responsibility of the German government and command for those crimes." The demand to create an international military tribunal was also contained in the declaration of the Soviet government of the 14th, 1942, and the title was about the responsibility of Nazi occupiers for the atrocities committed them in the occupied countries of Europe. On the 2nd of November of the same year, the Presidium of the Supreme Council of the Soviet Union formed an extraordinary state commission on the investigation of the atrocities of Nazi occupiers and their accomplices. This commission collected a lot of materials, a lot of evidence about the destruction of millions of people, including children, women, and old people, in the inhuman treatment of POWs and the destruction of cities, villages, and about the enslavement of millions of people. In November 1942, Moscow prepared a response to another British diplomatic note, on which Stalin wrote himself the Soviet government would welcome if, from this standpoint, we could achieve an agreement about setting up, even now, before the war is over, of an international tribunal. And that was done in the very beginning of the war. However, the idea of an international tribunal to try the Nazi criminals did not establish itself at once. Some of the Western politicians thought that they just do away with the military criminals without a legal procedure and formalities. Back in 1942, the Prime Minister of the UK, Winston Churchill, said that the Nazi leaders must be executed without trial. And he expressed that opinion several times up to 1944. Similar ideas existed overseas, on the other side of the Atlantic. In March 1943, the State Secretary of the United States, Hell, said at dinner in the presence of the British envoy Lord Halifax that he would prefer to physically destroy all the Nazi leaders. The generals had an even simpler outlook of the problem. On the 10th of July 1944, General Eisenhower suggested that the enemy leaders should be shot. There were also ideas to destroy the whole German general staff, the whole personnel of the SS, all of the leadership of the Nazi Party. Franklin Delano Roosevelt actually openly supported those ideas. On the 19th of August 1944, he noted, "We must be really cruel with Germany. And I mean all the German people, not just the Nazis. The Germans need to be either castrated or to treat them in such a way that they would even forget about the return of the people who would like to return the old times and to continue what they had been doing in the past." Such judgments were typical of many Americans. According to a sociological poll of 1945, 65% of the US citizens stood for a non-court execution of the Nazi criminals, actually for lynching. The British were just as revengeful, and they only discussed a place where to put the gallows and the length of ropes. The Minister of Economy, the Secretary for Economy of the United States, Mr. Morgenthau, said that Germany needs to be destroyed and turn their territory into one big potato field. Well, not quote indefinitely, but probably that was the fate awaiting for Germany, unless for the position of the Soviet Union, the firm position of the Soviet Union. Naturally, the atrocities of the Nazis caused a lot of indignation in many countries, including Russia, of course, because we were the main victims of the mass atrocity. There was a lot of people who wanted revenge and were not patient enough to wait for a trial that would be conducted under all the principles. There were non-trial executions. It was really difficult to accuse the French resistance fighters who executed over 8,000 of Nazis and their accomplices. Certainly, that was a retribution, but in the case of an open trial, the lessons of history would better match the spirit of the time and would be more visual and
serve as a lesson.
Would serve as a better lesson. Certainly, the leaders of the USSR turned out to be wiser than quite a lot of Western politicians by standing for a legal procedure from the very beginning of the war. When Churchill tried to impose his opinion on Stalin, Stalin firmly responded, "Whatever happens, there must be a court judgment. Otherwise, people will say that Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin just revenged their political enemies. We must act in such a fashion," the British Prime Minister insisted, "that even our grandchildren will not see Germany rise from the knees." Stalin was not in agreement with such a formula. He said, "Too stringent measures will inspire a desire for revenge." In the course of the war, the Soviet Union held the first public processes over Nazi criminals. The military tribunal in Kharkov in December 1943 considered the case of three German officers who were accused of barbarous executions of civilians using gas chambers. Gradually, our Western allies also came to the idea of a trial, and in the long run, the Soviet leadership has reached its objective. But in the opinion of the Prime Minister of the UK, the court or the trial should have been political and not a legal act. The President of the United States said that the procedure should not be too legal, and in any condition, correspondents and photographers were not to be admitted into the courtroom. So that was the official position of Americans. Russians had a different stance. To be just, I want to note that alongside with the cynical ideas of having the tribunal as a formality, there were also representatives from the Allied forces that expressed opinion concerning a just and serious trial and just verdicts. If we just want to shoot down Germans, and if that is our policy, Robert Jackson, the American judge, said, he was the prosecutor from the US at the trial. Let that be, but don't pretend this to be justice. If you decided to execute a person in any case, then there is no need to try him or her. Well, Jackson had political ambition, and I will be talking about that a bit later. He wanted to run for the presidency. So on the 17th of July, between the 17th of July and the 2nd of August, 1945, the Potsdam or the Berlin Conference of the heads of the USSR, the UK and the United States took place in Berlin. And it took important decisions on demilitarization and denazification of Germany and about the punishment of military criminals. What's very important is that the Allies undertook an obligation to try the culprits soon and justly. The final document noted that an agreed opinion on this problem will be established during the negotiations in London. It's no secret that while working on the Charter of the International Military Tribunal, there were a lot of arguments because the Allied had different legal systems, the Anglo-Saxon, Continental and the Soviet system. Each country had its own legal traditions, and the national laws differed quite seriously. Robert Jackson, that I already mentioned, recalled that he was really shocked to hear what the Russian delegation says about the Anglo-Saxon conviction system. They belong that the continental system of law is not just because it doesn't provide the defendant with all of the system of evidence collected against him. And he then says that certainly there is something rational in that criticism.
Because the whole process started with questioning, then the charges were brought against the people, and then they were brought to justice. Notwithstanding those difficulties and some misunderstandings, the lawyers of foreign countries found and struck a balance and found a unique box of tools which was quite efficient and effective, and it was done just 3 months after the act of capitulation was signed. After the 9th of May, on the 8th of August in London, this act was signed. On the 8th of August, 3 months after the victory over the Nazi Germany, on behalf of the USSR, US, France, UK governments, in London, a treaty on the law over Nazi war criminals was signed. An integral part of this treaty was the Charter of International War Tribunal for the court, and later 19 more states and countries joined in this treatment, and the tribunal could have been rightly called the Court of Peoples. The Charter legally fixed the responsibilities of those who instituted, who guided, and who realized the policy of war as the source of hatred and mass atrocities. Criminalization of aggression as the most grave international violence got an international legal framework. Mr. Nikitchenko, the former deputy head of the Supreme Court of the USSR, General Prosecutor Mr. Biddle, the UK Lord Lawrence was in charge, Donadier de Waber, the professor of criminal law. They are the members of the tribunal from all countries. Each of the 4 countries sends their main prosecutors, their deputies and their assistants. The Soviet delegation, just a little bit later, well, just in front, just in the very, almost in the very beginning, was headed by Roman Rudenko. He was the prosecutor of the Ukraine, USSR, of the Ukraine Soviet Republic, and why he was put into this position I'll explain a little bit later. The first joint meeting between the main prosecutors of the US, USSR, UK and France got over together to agree on the list of convicted. At first, people thought that there will be just 12 people from different governmental structures of the Nazi Germany. Nikitchenko, although stood for the fact that this list should also include the industrial, the corporate people from the industry of Germany, and the list grew. 3 people avoided justice: a lay who committed suicide before the court itself, Krupp, who thought to be ill, and Bormann, who was convicted in his absence because he ran away. I've visited Nuremberg a couple of times, and I was there just not so far ago, half a year ago or so, and I regularly visit the museum of Nuremberg, the so-called Hall 600, where I conduct meetings with schoolboys and girls, with students, with future lawyers, future prosecutors, and judges. I don't know why they haven't put it up on the screen. Maybe there's a technical problem, but some technical glitch, but there is actually a movie, and if you can do it right now, you'll be able to see how my lectures are conducted and how I teach schoolboys and girl students in Germany about the Nuremberg process. I would like to note that just after the World War II finished, there was a point of view that you cannot expect a just trial, because the Nuremberg process was going to be a trial of the victors over the losers. 10 years ago, in 2005, I was shooting a movie that's called the Nuremberg Toll. And I was taking an interview from Evelda Berschmidt, who's the deputy president of the Supreme Court, and he said that the court was not engaged. It was not just, it wasn't just, but it was also fair. And 8 months back ago, I came back there, and it was called, and I shoot another movie which was called 10 years, Nuremberg Process 10 years after. And I asked, and again I took the interview from Mr. Berschmidt, and he repeated the same. And I also spoke with Peter Kuspert, who was a prosecutor, and I think they shared the same opinion. And in particular, Kuspert, and I hope that finally the movie is going to be shown on the screen, but he told me, Mr. Kuspert, he told me, I confirm, well, let me talk for him then. I confirm the legal purity of the Nuremberg process. I think it was a very just process. The prosecutors collected thousands of documents, and we cross-examined more than 400 witnesses. I think he was now sent to Munich, and there he is head of the Supreme Courts of Munich. But these are the words of educated Germans who are very sober when looking at history. These are the real lawyers who put their life to serve the law, the justice, fairness. And what's important is that they are now organizing lectures in this whole 600. And I think this practice should be implemented in all the countries. It would be nice already this year, in November, just before and the anniversary of the Nuremberg process, to organize such kind of lectures in all of our schools about the beginning of the process. An important practice in the Nuremberg process was that convicted were guaranteed. They had guarantees that they could be defended either personally or by means of a lawyer. They could be cross-examined. They could bring in witnesses. For example, convicted would be given defenders, the Germans, who were paid good money at the time. They had 27 lawyers at their disposal. Many of those lawyers were still members of the Nazist parties. They were assisted by 54 loyal assistants and 67 secretaries. They had an opportunity to get familiar with all the materials of the case. And actually it was made unexclusively, unconditionally, under the even if it was just even if they just asked, and after that they were brought to court. The number of witnesses from prosecution was 2 times bigger than from the side of convictors. 3 times. 2 times more. Oh, sorry. So 3 times more was 3 times more. 3 times it took longer 3 times to listen to the prosecutors, to the lawyers than the prosecution. For example, the case itself contains 40 volumes and 16,000 pages. That's the material covered. Everything was recorded on discs and tape. 6,000 permits to get into the courtroom were handed over. Media, press, radio, cinema were attending. 250 places were taken by the representatives of the media out of 350. Really, the Nuremberg process was a court and not a massacre of the victors over the losers. The Soviet delegation had done a great work on preparing themselves to the court process and the trial. Lots and lots of materials had to be put in order, and documents that were obtained by the Extraordinary State Committee, and all these documents had to be put into order, and the Soviet Union had delegated a small group of experts who were systemizing these materials. There was an investigative group headed by Mr. Alexandrov. And there was a group of people working directly with the documents. Alexandrov has left lots of memories and lots of memoirs. He was a very intelligent person, Mr. Alexandrov. He used to be very active in the past, and he told a lot about the Nuremberg process. During the process and in the process of the trial, 3 Hoffmans were participating. One of the Hoffmans, Joseph Hoffman, and I met him many times, was an adjunct and personal bodyguard of Mr. Rudenka. 5 months before his death, and he died unfortunately 22 days before now, in November 2014, we talked to him in Poltava. In very difficult conditions, let me tell you. During the shooting of the movie, The Nuremberg, 70 years after, well, he told me with tears in his eyes, and in this movie you will see him, and I will draw your attention to it when I'll be showing it to you. So he said, with tears in his eyes, how he liberated Lubla, where Majdanek, the concentration camp, was. He was really amazed at the scope of the concentration camp, and the Nazis themselves used it as the camp of destruction. And I cite him word by word. On the territory of this camp, we could still see campfires where human bodies were burning. He told me that several months ago. 6 gas chambers, more than 1,000 persons each, couldn't cope with the bodies. The inmates told us later that the ashes, the feces, would collect and then grow plants on it. The whole territory of the camp was covered with ash. The father and the uncle of Mr. Hoffman died. Several times over, when we met with him, he told me that he was a witness of the fact when his grandfather and grandmother were buried alive, and he was 15 years old back in the time because they were Jews. We should also mention that the Soviet convictors, they brought over the witnesses and brought over the evidence not only about the war crimes committed against USSR, but also against Czechoslovakia, Poland, Yugoslavia, Greece, and also about a mass murder of 50 POWs of the British Air Force who left in March 1944 from the camp in Sagan, and they were shot after they were caught under the decree of Hitler. Unfortunately, I have to skip some things in here, and let me move over to the court, to the trial itself. There were many disputes between the Allies when bringing over and preparing the charge and the conviction. For example, one of the discussion was there really an agreement between the leaders of the Germany or a general plan? And the representatives of France, Mr. de Vabre and his deputy, Mr. Falco, couldn't find any evidence for that. An American judge, Mr. Biddle, who believed that there was no preliminary agreement between the leaders of the Nazis Germany, and there wasn't such a term in the international law. And the British law, he said, was similar to the Soviet law in this thing, that there's no such term as conspiracy. And Mr. Bucket said that if there is a general plan, or if there is a plot or a conspiracy, then it's a principal point for the trial, because otherwise the trial against Nazis, the party and the state would turn into the court against the bunch of specific persons. And for example, and finally the compromise was found. Almost all the research states that the Russian and the Soviet judges were very rigid and were very strict, because they were for hanging all the convicts. But actually, Joseph Davidovich, who died several years ago, said that we shot that in Poltava in December. Actually, it was Mr. Rudenko, the main prosecutor from the USSR, who asked death penalty for everyone. However, the Soviet judges were against his opinion and couldn't follow in his line. They believed that Denis, Papin and Fritzsche deserve being put to prison for 10 years, and Schacht and Frick for a life imprisonment. The French side spoke for a life imprisonment for Jodl, Rosenberg, Frank, Frick, and Americans were for life imprisonment for Rosenberg and Frick. The judges from the USSR and France, they didn't want to justify anyone, and the French didn't agree to hanging, but they suggested to shoot everyone. These old disputes were also due to the fact that the members of the tribunal were even, and their voices would very often divide into two parts, equal parts. However, for final decision, at least 3 out of 4 voices had to be for, and very often judge assistants participated in the voting, but very often it also led to an even score. For example, 3 convicted were found not guilty. However, Mr. Nikitchenko, De Vabre and Lawrence, Mr. Nikitchenko and Vabre were for convicting, and Mr. Lawrence and Biddle were against. And since 3 voices were needed to find somebody not guilty, Schacht was found not guilty. Many people write abroad about their own participants in the trial, but there are almost no books about the Soviet representatives who, before the Nuremberg process, in a very harsh military environment, collected the evidence, and during the process itself fought for the rule of law and just ruling. So how did it happen? Well, since there's no time, I will just briefly touch upon the main prosecutor from the USSR, Mr. Rudenko, who was 38 years then. Let's have a look at the Nuremberg process in time and in space, and let's draw some parallels. This year, the main convictor, the main prosecutor from the US, Mr. Jackson, had very big ambitions. He wanted to run for presidency, and I talked about that, and he didn't conceal this. It was his main position, and this mindset, with this mindset he traveled to Nuremberg. And as opposed to Roman Rudenko had no presidential ambitions whatsoever, and he couldn't just have those presidential ambitions because he was born to a peasant family with many kids. Rudenko had to cover all the steps of his uneasy path towards the prosecutor's position. And 1 year before the war, a little bit more than 1 year, he was relieved of his prosecutor's obligations, and he was almost repressed back in the past, and during the first days of the war he was hanging up in the air almost, and he writes a letter on the 9th of June. We show it in the movie, we show the original of this letter. He asks to be sent to the forefront, and he's sent to the forefront. Then his military career starts, and in 1943 he becomes the main prosecutor of Ukraine, of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. And as opposed to his chief colleagues, chief prosecutors of the UK, US and France, Rudenko knew what is war and what are the atrocities of war. He knew it firsthand. Before Nuremberg, he was heading an investigative group that went after the forefront and collected evidence of the crimes of war. Then he was also the main prosecutor during the two outspoken processes against fascism in Kharkiv and Moscow. Rudenko's speeches at processes and at trials were always very convicting, very loud, legally impeccable, with lots of evidence and blaring. And during his speeches, he didn't just convict. He went up to great heights of philosophical understanding of global tragedy. He uncovered the depth of fascism, the atrocious plans of destroying huge states and peoples, and this and the danger of the national of the Nazis' ideas. He was 2 meters in height, higher than me. I am just 1.83 meters. And there's one other story, let me tell you. I need to note that Mr. Rudenko was a son of Sergei Rudenko, a diplomat. Rudenko knew how to find how to make ties and how to make contact with people. Originally, his relations with an American prosecutor, Jackson, were quite tense because American prosecutor wanted to demonstrate that he's in charge in here. And actually, I could read it from telegrams of Mr. Rudenko. And this Jackson guy asked for some cars to be sent to him, some drivers to be sent to him from the Russian side. It's a very interesting letter exchange, actually. I have it, and in the book we show it. Well, what did I say? I was saying that Jackson tried to demonstrate that he was the one in charge. Sorry for being distracted by the movie, because the movie, I see people are watching the movie and I'm trying to comment at the same time what's happening in the movie and trying to comment what's going on, and I'm being distracted from my original thoughts. Sorry for that. So the Nuremberg, well, Nuremberg was an American occupation zone, and definitely Americans felt like in command, because they were the ones responsible for safety and security. But Rudenko was quite reserved but firm. And then in some time, these relations with Jackson melted and thawed, and only one case changed it all. 3 months after the trial started, 1 year after almost, Rudenko was reported that American soldiers next to his house are warming themselves up next to a fire, and they feed this fire with documents taken from a Soviet truck that brings these documents for the Nuremberg tribunal and the Nuremberg trial. And they were feeding these documents, American soldiers were feeding these documents to fire, the evidence. And I could actually find this house. Roman definitely got really upset, and And he informed Jackson. Jackson was shocked, and everybody was expecting scandals out of it. But Rudenko, I think he really acted as a man, as a real man. He watched and he saw that the documents that were burned in this fire by American soldiers have not a big significance, and he decided to hush this all up. Maurice Fuchs, a bodyguard of Jackson, his personal bodyguard, I think he will be shown in here. I've met him a couple of years ago, almost 8 years, but he was telling me about those relations between Jackson and Rudenko. Hoffman told me that as well, and Fuchs also told me that. It was very interesting to juxtapose these two interventions. They told me that Jackson really liked to frequent Rudenko. They would sit in front of the end of the hearth of the fire. They would smoke cigars. Rudenko met Jackson in a lobby. They had a vestibule there. You'll probably see this vestibule over there in the movie. And Rudenko would come to Jackson as well. He would visit him. He had a big fleet of cars, German cars, and Jackson used to show those cars to Rudenko. Okay, let's come back to the trial.
In December 1945, there was another event that nearly made two delegations quarrel. That is, 2 months after the start of the trial. The relationships between the Rudenko and Jackson were very tense. You can imagine that Edelweiss division is very close, and they listen to Goering, and the Goering is feeling he's a leader. Nobody interrupts him, and they applaud to him. Everyone is very happy with Goering behavior in the room. He puts an American blanket on a bench, and if you watch it, this is the funeral of Field Marshal Paulus. He was buried near Baden-Baden. I found his grave there, and he's buried there with his sister in 1956. Cornelia died in 1951, but this is also the grave of his wife and son. But I will come back to this episode. This is the, in the movie, this is the funeral of Field Marshal Paulus. So in December, when the tension between the prosecutors and between the judges really prevailed, and when Goering was giving witness, there was a tragic event. At 12 o'clock at night, a car came to a Grand Hotel, a car that was servicing the Soviet delegation, and suddenly a person came up with a gun and shot Sergeant Bubin, killed him dead. And Bubin said that the murderer was in American uniform, and they never found the murderer. Naturally, there was a lot of tension, but the process was underway, and that aggravated the situation very seriously. And in a month, the American soldiers started burning those Soviet documents. So the process was difficult enough, and the relationships were also, well, took a lot of time to establish. They didn't find the murderer, but there were a lot of people who wanted Rudenko and Jackson to fall out, and it could be the remaining SS people who threatened to kidnap the judges and the prosecutors. But that's why the blinds were tightly drawn in the room, and the prisoners were brought over an underground gallery, but they really could not find the murderer of the Russian sergeant. Hoffman, number 2, Yevgeny Hoffman, left a lot of interesting evidence too. He was the head of the Soviet interpreters. In his memoirs, he tells how, for the first time, simultaneous interpreter was used. Before that, simultaneous interpreter was not widely used. After that, simultaneous interpreting was used in the Tokyo trials, then in the UN, and he says, I entered the room and I saw those glass booths. He didn't know what they were intended for, and then he was told that the simultaneous interpreters would interpret from those booths. There was a third Hoffman, who was a photographer and a close friend of Hitler and Eva Braun. The Nazis used the fact that the simultaneous interpretation was for the first time, and the interpreters really made mistakes, and Kaltenbrunner, Goering, and others tried to confuse the interpreters and the prosecutors, and the film provides examples of that. There were cases when the interpreters were really outraged by the quick speeches by the defendants, and they just threw down the earpieces. The interpreters had to work a lot, and they went on strike, and so they had to make breaks in the proceedings of the tribunal. But of course, it were the foreign interpreters who went on strike, not the Soviet ones, and those who serviced the delegations of France, the UK, and the US. Well, I'll tell you another story, which was never published anywhere. It was at night, and the Soviet translators were translating a speech, and they had to translate the speech into all the languages, into French, English, and German. And suddenly, there is very little time. They have to produce a translation, and a group of translators was headed by American Colonel Doster. And Rudenko comes up to him and says, "Colonel, I ask you to organize the translation because this is very important. The process is being very dynamic. The defendants provide a lot of evidence, and the doser says, no, that's practically impossible." And the American interpreters were actually Russian aristocrats, Vasilsikov, Serebreny, Trubetskoy, and others. And the Russian group of translators was headed by Princess Tatiana Trubetskaya. She heard Colonel say that and said, "Mr. Colonel, do not interfere into our Russian affairs. We will figure it out ourselves, but I will mobilize every Russian interpreter, and we will have this text translated overnight." And so for the first time since 1917, the two Russias united for a common purpose. We were shown Paulus, his surrender. Marshal Paulus deserves attention. That was a critical tactical move by the Russian prosecution, and that was bringing Field Marshal Paulus as a witness to the trials. The Field Marshal was secretly brought to a city that teemed with secret services. Everyone in Germany thought that Paulus was dead. 3 years before, there was a national mourning announced in Germany, and Hitler made a speech about the heroic death of Paulus. Hitler placed a marshal's wand into the coffin, but the coffin was empty. Paulus was in Russia. He was kept for the trial of the Nazi criminals. The idea of a secret transportation of Paulus to Nuremberg belonged to Rudenko, and he told that to me himself. And Paulus was of great importance for our delegation and for the whole of process, because he was the only one from the top leaders of the Reich who could reconfirm that the plan of a sudden attack of the Soviet Union had been developed long before June 1941. Please pay attention. Those who are trying to rewrite the history are trying to avoid this fact and never talk about that, because the Nazis said that it was the Soviet Union who was threatening them, and they just made a preventive strike. Paulus, in the presence of 250 journalists and witnesses and judges and prosecutors and experts, had revealed that lie. When Justice Lawrence, the chair of the tribunal, here are the Nazi leaders coming out of the lift, asked Rudenko, how much time would you need to bring Paulus from Moscow? The answer was laconic. I think a few minutes. The audience froze, and that was the moment of the truth for Rudenko. That was one thing when if Paulus would submit evidence in Moscow, and it was quite another thing for him to bring evidence against his accomplices who participated in developing the Barbarossa plan. What would have happened if Paulus did not confirm his evidence given in Moscow? Rudenko would probably lose his position, but Paulus confirmed all his previous evidence. And then the spring of 1946 came. The process was well underway. Good relationships have been established between the state prosecutors. The judges started understanding one another. Paulus provided important evidence, but the final battle was ahead. But something unexpected had happened. On the 5th of March 1946, Churchill, who lost the election, went to the US and makes his Fulton speech. You remember that initially the prosecutor from the UK was representing the Conservatives, but when Churchill lost the election, they changed the prosecutor. But let's go back to Churchill. He makes a 15-minute speech whose sense is communism is a threat to the West. So we need to struggle against the USSR. As you remember, the United Kingdom at that time even foresaw a secret plan of attacking the Soviet Union, but was not supported by the United States. That was a signal towards the start of a Cold War, towards an Iron Curtain, and really the defendants were joyful. Goering said that we will defeat them all. Rudenko told me that the judges kept silent in their room for 3 days. Everyone was very polite. Everyone was thinking about how to conduct the trials further, but no one understood what would have been the political term. But we need to praise the lawyers. In this case, the lawyers' common sense prevailed. Everyone forgot about politics and understood that the Nazis might avoid punishment. The corporate interest came to the forefront. The accusations against Goering were correct, and Goering went all out and started behaving very blatantly. He knew that he would be sentenced to a capital punishment, and he wanted to take a nice leave. So he started his last fight with the tribunal. He boldly confronted the tribunal. He was very daring. His gait was very confident when he came out to give the evidence. And Judge Burkitt wrote very interesting memoirs about the last interrogation of Goering by Jackson. And this is how the witness assesses this interrogation. The cross-interrogation continued for 10 minutes, when it became absolutely clear that the situation is fully controlled not by Judge Jackson, but by Goering. Very polite, with a lot of insight, very witty, very artful. He assessed the situation at once. And as his confidence grew, his advantages were more and more obvious. He possessed the witnesses stand for nearly 2 days, and never he was interrupted at any circumstances. Some people thought that Jackson did that on purpose. I was a witness, Hoffman continues. Hoffman was also present at the interrogation. I was a witness of Goering interrogation by Jackson. Goering was a clever man. Everyone recognized that. Well, Jackson was a very clever man, but he had little evidence, and then Jackson threw down the file and refused to interrogate Goering. Then Rudenko led the interrogation and actually made Goering confess. Well, he didn't confess, in fact, but Rudenko defeated him. One of the American journalists said that Goering found it hard under the machine gun fire of Rudenko's questions. The next day, Los Angeles newspaper wrote that the outraged Rudenko took out a pistol and shot Goering. And when our journalists asked why they wrote that lie, they said, well, doesn't matter really, Rudenko's questions nearly killed him as well as the bullets. And the Russian proverb, well, was changed at that moment, that you should be afraid of the bull in the front, of the horse in the back, and you should be afraid of American journalists from all sides. However, it was obvious Goering was done with. Rudenko put a final stop, or an exclamation mark, in that interrogation. His questions really depressed Goering. After that, the Vice Marshal went down, changed his behavior, and that was noticed by all the present in the room, after which the authority of Rudenko grew, and everybody started talking about his high professionalism. The part that Rudenko played was brilliant and really undefined his further career. In 1953, he was appointed Attorney General of the USSR, spent 27 years in that position, and throughout the nearly 300 years of the Russian prosecutor's office, there was only one prosecutor, Prince Vyazemsky, who spent over 29 years in that position in the times of Catherine II. In November 1946, the defendants were mostly found guilty against humanity. 12 of them, including Goering, were sentenced to hanging, 7 to a prison term of different length, and 3 were acquitted. The Soviet side insisted on a more stringent sentence. Nikitchenko submitted that proposal. The principles of the Nazi state were announced to be criminal, but despite the opinion of the Russian government, of the High Command, the General Staff, and the SA stormtroopers were not considered guilty. There were other trials after the Nuremberg trial, trial of so-called Eisatz group, whose task was to destroy those who presented threat to Germany in the occupied territories. They destroyed over 1 million people in Poland and the Soviet Union. I met Benjamin Feed. He was 27 years at that time. When I met him, he was over 90. He was already over 90, and he answered to my question. I still believe that and he was the main prosecutor from the United States. the lessons of history taught at Nuremberg only make sense if they are used to prevent similar crimes in the future. And when asked about what he remembered best, he said, "During the trial, I was rather struck by the absence of any feeling of guilt by the defendants about their compassion to the people they killed." He was a brilliant speaker. He spoke without any paper, and he had a perfect command of memory, even of minor things. The bitter experience of the Second World War made us take a different look at many problems that the humanity faces, and to understand that every person on earth is responsible for the future. The fact that the Nuremberg process did take place means that the heads of state cannot rely on impunity and go down to double standards. The Nuremberg trial was an important milestone in the development of national and international law and continues to seriously impact the development of a lot of international common and agreement laws and national and international institutions. It facilitated that the UN adopted the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide and Punishment for Genocide in 1948, and also in the 4 Geneva Conventions in 1949 concerning the victims of war. In the early 90s of the previous century, the United Nations Security Council set up special tribunals on Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Special international treaty, the Statute of Rome on the setting up of the International Criminal Court, led to a creation of a permanent judicial instance that would try people guilty of international crime. It's important that those tribunals are not only based on the provisions of the Nuremberg trial and the sentence passed by the Nuremberg trial, but creatively develop them.
However, many things are yet to be done as far as the international tools are considered to fight off international crime. For example, we need to still think, why out of 192, actually this is the villa where our delegation lived, why out of 192 UN members, 137, more than two-thirds, are still not a part to a convention that was agreed upon in 1968 on the non-applicability of statutory limitations to war crimes and crimes against humanity. The Nuremberg trial lessons are timely already now, because many prejudices, political prejudices, national egoism are thriving. We shouldn't contribute to the fact that these things that the bodies of international crime justice served as a tool to achieve political goals and political objectives of certain states or groups of states. I need to ask, who blocked the International Crime Court on South Ossetia, and who doesn't allow to start crime prosecution for those crimes that were committed in August 2009? Why all the materials were transferred to the Russian Federation in this court already back in already in 2009? Why this court is inactive in time where there are war crimes being committed today in the southeast of the Ukraine, where children, elderly people, men and women die? The time is a strict judge. It's absolute. It's not determined by the actions of men, but it doesn't forgive and forget, irrespective relations to verdicts that were once given by peoples or the states. Unfortunately, the time on the face of this watch never show the vector of the humanity movement, but these figureheads count moments, and these moments is a sentence to those who wants to stay in France with time. In the time after the Nuremberg process, we thought that a positive impetus has been given to unroot the brown plague. The Nuremberg process role is absolutely unarguable. Thousand Nazis and their associates were brought to court. By the way, the atrocities that were committed in the occupied territories of the USSR were made by the hands of collaborationists, who sometimes were even more atrocious than the Germans themselves. In the 90s, last century, we communicate a lot with a couple of European countries, Israel, Canada, US, USSR. For example, we send one of the British historian all the materials about the guards at Nazis' concentration camps. Recently, Vladimir Katuk was brought to court for organizing genocide in Khatyn in Belarus, and it was done in 2008. Unfortunately, Canada, who was actually responsible for bringing him to charge, did not respond to our call, and there is an international principle, because I think they are acting under a double standard, and they've ignored our request. In 2008, they actually removed all the charges from him, but we don't really see for what particular reasons. We also should mention that political and legal legal things allowed many Nazis to avoid responsibilities. For example, in the US, there was a scandal report issued just some time ago about the life of many actors of the Third Reich who escaped to America and fled there. After they crossed the ocean, the fascists and their accomplices, as we found out, were quite high on demand in the Central Investigative Agency and in the military industry of the US. How many Nazis fled to the US, we don't know, but probably several thousand. And that's not the first evidence that the citadel of democracy covered and concealed many Nazi accomplices. This dirty story became widely known thanks to a report of our colleagues from the Ministry of Justice from the US. The publication of this report was really driven down by many Washington leaders. The work on the report was done by a senior lawyer, Mark Richard, who convinced his colleagues in 1999 about the need to talk about a critical page in the story of the US, and we just need to pay tribute to the civil to the spirit of this person. Only 6 years after the work was finished, but it was not given a green light for publication, and only thanks to a lawyer, Mr. Sobel, who brought a charge to court. The Ministry of Justice presented a copy of the presentation and of the report, however, excluding a couple of thousand pages from it. However, the New York Times found the full report. The Ministry of Justice said that the report is not full and there are many factual errors, but what kind of errors, they don't talk about it. So why did it all become possible? After Cold War instilled, the West started looking at the USSR as at the enemy, and for many people, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So the question comes, how many and what kind of efforts have to be undertaken so that the Nuremberg experience led to particular and concrete learnings that would become, and there's Mr. Breshman here, that would become a precursor to a world order without wars and violence, that's based and built on real non-interference into the internal activities of other states and peoples, and the respect towards the right of people. Mr. Rudenko stated several times in his speech that the convicted should be punished with all the force of law, not just but the wrongdoings they did, but for the sake of strengthening the world of peace across the world and for the safety of people in the future. The main prosecutor of the US, Jackson, used to say that it's undoubtedly that punishing just a couple of Nazi leaders and leaving in other and leaving others unpunished and leaving intact the whole web of Nazi organizations would only contribute for a new fetus of Nazis developing. And we see that it's happened. The evil has not been destroyed completely, but it's been banned, it's been driven out, but unbeaten and unkilled, it strives to be, and it raises from ashes. But have a look. First, German generals are trying to find causes and excuses in his speeches, and today many stories and TV shows are being shot. For example, there's one movie showing that it's the US who won the whole war, and these memoirs, they white off the Third Reich, and they black out those who fought against fascism, including our generals and leaders. And a very common example is being used, showing fascists in a very commonplace scene and situation. Have a look. They're normal people. They're not killers. Let's take Himmler. He is a very soft person, they say. But who was the soft person? And I took a couple of his comments. He said once, "How do Russians feel? How do Czech feel? I don't care. Whether other people are prosper or they die from hunger, I'm only interested in that because we can use them as slaves for our culture. Everything else, I don't care. Will they die when building an anti-tank pit? Will 10,000 Russian women die from hunger or not? I'm interested in that only since this pit, anti-tank pit, has to be built for Germany." I'm citing Himmler right now. There are some warm colors that are used in this whole painting for Hitler even. In Hitler's Science, you would find a couple of descriptions of him, painting him as a bold and military person of the First World War. He's an artistic person, an artist, a person who knows art, a vegetarian, and a great leader. And unfortunately, we have to state that we live in a very unstable world, in a very fragile and a very vulnerable, and contradictions between developed countries and other countries are becoming more acute. There are great chasms separating cultures and civilizations. It's not a secret that the idea of fascism and Nazism influences the young people, those who haven't seen the atrocities of war, and this is a great danger for the future generations. We cannot but note that the actions of authorities in some countries, whether directly or indirectly, contribute to that. In a couple of countries in the world, and as strange as it may seem in Europe, active attempts are being made of reviewing and revisiting history and the role of the Soviet Union in the World War II. They're trying to make Stalinism and Nazism equal. In this attacks over history, international organizations are being attracted as experts. The Council of Europe, for example, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, OECD. Of course, we want to talk about Nuremberg principles prevailing in the current world. We wanted to talk about the Nuremberg principles being brought to practice and governments cooperating. But unfortunately, we don't see it. There is one particular principle in Nuremberg tribunal proceedings, the inevitability of law. However, the humanity is not capable of doing it at the moment. Impunity shouldn't be left to its own devices, but when it comes to international practice, we see double practices, and we hear some presidents in America saying, yes, he is the son of a bitch, but he is our son of a bitch. And when Mr. Putin says the vaccine against Nazism that's been developed during the Nuremberg tribunal is losing its power and force in many countries, and this saddens us. Why? Because today we see many examples of how Nazi ideology is being revived. We see how the history is being distorted, how the lessons of the World War II are being distorted. Let's just remember Mr. Yatsenuk's revelations, who said that the Soviets invaded Ukraine and Germany. Even Merkel corrected him. I think it can only be assessed in one way. It's the distortion of history. That's desecration of the memory of people who died, millions of Ukrainians who died from Nazis and their accomplices. The activity of International Military Tribunal is sometimes called a Nuremberg epilogue. As regards the punished heads of the Third Reich and organizations, this metaphor is quite just. But the evil of fascism and Nazism and its different forms and ways is more livable than many thought back in the past, in the 1940s, and the climax of euphoria of the Great War. Moreover, this evil is being now reviving in the victory countries. Unfortunately, the practice of our days and the neighboring countries in Russia shows that if the human nature is not banging on the drums and banging in the toll, we are to expect not the best times. The story is moving over a spiral. Look in the internet and you'll find sites that celebrate fascism and romanticize SS. And little people know about the lessons of Nuremberg. There's been a poll conducted, and in accordance with this poll, 70% of all students from 15 to 17 years didn't know anything about the Nuremberg Tribunal. 19% have heard about it, and only 11% of young people have heard and they know about the process. Unfortunately, we have to state today that people don't have immunity, inbuilt and inborn immunity to Nazism and extremism, including the young people of anti-Hitler coalition. For example, in the US today there are 900 extremist groups, including the neo-Nazi ones, 923 to be precise. We need extensive efforts to be spent on bringing up the new people, promoting anti-Nazism, and legal work is required. Starting from 2004, Russia has initiated, and a couple of other countries in the General Assembly of the UN initiate resolutions to fight off fascism and neo-Nazism. The last one was adopted on the 18th of December 2014, and it's entitled "The Fight Against Heroization of Nazism, Neo-Nazism, and so on and so forth," a very long name. The co-authors of this document were 44 countries altogether. The resolution, for example, expresses deep concerns about celebrating in any way and form the Nazis movement, neo-Nazism, the former members of the Waffen-SS organization, and any attempts on making the members of this organization and painting them as participants of national and liberating movements. Actually, the votes on this resolution was quite interesting one. For 133. Against 4, and I think you can call at least 2 countries, and you can name them. It's the US and Canada. For the first time, it was Ukraine and a tiny state of Palau. And I would like to say that May last year, Russia instituted criminal punishment for Nazis' glorification, for promotion and propaganda of Nazi crimes. And if I remember it right, you can get a sentence of up to 5 years imprisonment. What saddens us is also the fact that, but that's only about Russia, that unfortunately we do too little translations to other languages, our Russian literature on these topics. And I talk about that at many presentations. And I used to say we don't do anything, but we have many of Western books translated into Russian, and the shelves in our bookstores are crumbling under the weight of those books. Have a look. We have memoirs from SS soldiers, from Luftwaffe officers and Wehrmacht soldiers. Just walk into a store abroad, and I usually do this when I am traveling. You don't find any Russian books about the World War II, but you'll find lots and lots of others about the Nuremberg process, not a single book. And in 25 years we haven't translated not a single book, and we haven't published it on the net. And at the same time we keep surprising that many foreigners don't know all the truth about the Second World War, about its true victims, the heroes and anti-heroes of it.
Actually, there were very few translations from Russian into other languages even during the Soviet times. So there's no wonder that the true history of the Second World War, the war fought by our fathers and grandfathers, is little known abroad. we generate those books and we consume those books ourselves. I will just provide one example. About 8 years ago, there was a book exhibition in Moscow, and my book on Nuremberg trial was there, and Americans and English came up and asked, what kind of book is that? It's a book about Nuremberg trial. And who's the author? He's a Russian. And what can the Russians know about Nuremberg trial? So I believe that we do have something to say and to write. We need to make presentations, you need to shoot films, and you need to render the truth to other nations about what us and the Allies did during the war and after the war. We should remind those who forgot and educate those who do not know. So, dear colleagues, all of us need to do quite a lot for the truth about the Second World War and about the part played by the USSR, about the preparation and the proceedings of Nuremberg trial would be rendered to the people who don't know it and overcome blatant lie and also breaks the silence. For the Nuremberg principles to triumph worldwide and to be really implemented in real life. Thank you for your attention.